So I want you to think back. Think back to last Sunday afternoon. You got it in your mind? Turn to somebody real quickly. You got 5 seconds. Tell them what you did last Sunday afternoon. Mark, set, go. Mm-hmm. All right, so let's just see. Let's just see how many of you watched a little football last Sunday afternoon. A lot of you, millions of people around the United States watched football last Sunday afternoon. And even if you didn't watch football last Sunday afternoon, I guarantee you heard about one play last Sunday afternoon, right? This one play. A lot of you in here are Saints fans. This is going to sting. One play, Saints are driving. End of the game. It looks like they're going to win, right? Everything is going their way. And then the play happened. The play heard around the world. And just in case you didn't see it, or to drive you deeper into pain today, we have the play right here for you to see again. Oh, yeah.
Incomplete, no flag for Tommy Lee Lewis. Nikel Roby-Coleman delivered a hit. And the two officials
one more time.
You
right slow-mo. Oh, yeah, right there.
Crazy as there's no flag right on the Saints side.
No flag right there. So what you got there is that in one moment, the entire world tweeted in unison, right? Where was the flag, right? There are rules. In football, there are rules. And not only are there rules, but there are rules that should be applied. Because when you have rules, it allows a game or life to be played fairly and predictably. And here's the thing, even for folks who say, I don't like law, I don't like to play by the rules, I guarantee you like to play by the rules. You want everyone else to play by the rules. That's true in football, it's true in life. And here's the thing, it was also true for the Jews in Jesus' day. They lived by the rules, by the laws, by the commandments that they found in the Old Testament. In the first century, people would have known the rules. They would have grown up with them. They would have breathed them in life. They would have known when the rules were being followed and when the rules weren't being followed. Because if you were a good Jew in the first century, you knew that in the law, the Torah, there were 613 laws, right? And you were required to follow all of them. And here's why. There's an important reason for that. It wasn't just so you could follow the rules, but if you followed the law, then the law mediated God's will. This is important. The law mediated God's will. In other words, if you followed the law, then you lived in God's will. You were a part of what God was doing in the world. But if you broke the law, then you weren't living in God's will. You weren't a part of what God was doing in the world. When Jesus comes on the scene, Jesus knows all of those rules, knows all the commandments, knows all of the laws. Why? Because Jesus was raised as a good Jewish man. We see from his early days that he was taken to the temple at certain points. His parents taught him all 613 rules. But when he began to teach and to preach and to heal, as he began to journey all around Galilee and Judea, Jewish leaders looked at him and wondered if he really had a commitment to the rules, or if he was like the referees in the Saints game, just going to, kind of pick and choose the rules that he would follow. And this was important because, again, what do the rules do? What do the laws do in the Jewish mind? They mediate the will of God. Was Jesus following the will of God if he wasn't following all the laws? And so Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, almost at the beginning, right after he says, this is how you need to begin to see the world, Jesus takes this on. Jesus takes on how we see and understand the Torah, the laws, the commandments, the rules that they were called to live by. And this is an important thing for Jesus to address for how he and his followers will live in the will of God. It was an important issue for the early church to address as well. And here's the thing, I think it's important for us to think about as well. What's our relationship to the Old Testament? Because here's what I find. On one side of the spectrum, you find people who grip the Old Testament very tightly, and they'll tell you, nothing has passed away. We have to follow every bit of it. And on the other end, you have people who let it go. Oh, those are just a bunch of rules and laws, people 2,000 years ago. We can't relate to them. They don't have anything to do with us. And so we have both ends of the spectrum. Probably in this room, we have both ends of the spectrum. But here's what Jesus does. Jesus says neither one is right, neither one is wrong. And Jesus forges a new path in what he teaches here. So let me read a little bit of what Jesus says about this. We're going to start chapter 5, verse 17. We're going to read just a couple of the verses, and we're going to talk about them. Verse 17, Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." The word abolish there, another way to translate this word is to repeal, to do away with. And what Jesus says here, I'm not here to repeal, I'm not here to do away with any of the commands. And if just on first glance, if you read all of this, then you would think that Jesus was siding with the people over here with the tight grip on the commandments. If you break or teach someone to break even one of the least of the commandments, you're going to be least in the kingdom of heaven, right? That's what Jesus says. And so it makes us think, well, maybe we're supposed to keep all of them, all of the dietary restrictions, laws around circumcision, the 10 Commandments, all of the stuff in Leviticus, all of it. But let's think about the life of Jesus for just a minute, this least and great of the commandments. Jesus moved around teaching, and as he did, there were laws that he didn't follow. Often we find this, that he was criticized for breaking the Sabbath laws. He ate with sinners. He ate with the unclean. He touched the unclean. He touched lepers. He talked to women in public. There were laws against Jewish men talking to women in public. And yet we find multiple times in his ministry, Jesus talking to women in public. It seems like Jesus struggled sometimes with the least and the great of the commandments. So what do we do with that? And it's not just Jesus. When we fast forward a little bit and we get to the early church in the book of Acts, there's a big fight. Does it surprise you that the church had fights? Shouldn't surprise anybody. Church had fights. But here was their fight in the book of Acts. They fought because these early Jewish Christians couldn't decide what to do with the non-Jews who wanted to become Christians. Did they have to follow all of the laws? Did they have to get circumcised? Did they have to follow all the dietary restrictions? And after prayer and conversation, here's what the early church does. They basically get rid of the dietary restrictions, the need for circumcision, all the cleanliness rituals. All of that is pushed away. The least and even some of the great of the commandments. And let's think about our relationship for just a second to some of the Old Testament law. Let's just test how compliant you are this morning. Any of you wearing cloth made from two different materials? Anybody wearing a nice wool cotton blend this morning? Anybody got a nice poly cotton blend on this morning? You are breaking Leviticus 19. Any of you ever built a house? Anybody suffered through building a house? How many of you, when you built your house, how have you put a parapet around the edges of your roof? If you didn't, you are not following Deuteronomy 22. And here's the thing. Crawfish season kicks off in just a couple weeks. I'm going to tell you, I am going to religiously break the law against eating shellfish. It's who I am. It's what I do. Even the most faithful followers of Jesus don't follow every jot and tittle of the law, as the old translation says. We break the least. We even sometimes break the great. So what do what do we do with all of this? What do we do with what Jesus seemingly says and the reality of his life and the early church in our lives? Well, let's go back to verse 17. Let's look a little bit closer at what Jesus actually says in verse 17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or prophets. I have come not to abolish, but what are the next two words? To fulfill. I've come to fulfill. And those two words are critical for us. Because when something is fulfilled, what does that mean? When something is fulfilled, it is made whole. It is made complete. In some senses even, it is ended. Jesus says, I have come not to abolish, to repeal, to get rid of the law, but to complete, to make it full. Think of it this way. I don't know how many of you ever had a student loan. Student loans are fun, aren't they? Just a lot of fun. College students now, run from them if you can. In seminary, I had student loans, plural, I think. And so it took me 10 solid years of paying off student loans. Anybody else know the feeling of that? And after 120 payments, I made the last payment on the student loan. In a real sense, I fulfilled my obligation to the student loan. Now, that didn't mean it went away. It didn't mean it was abolished. It didn't mean it disappeared completely from my life. I can still go online and look at my student loan and celebrate that I've paid it off. Just because it was over didn't mean it went away. The memory of it didn't go away. It still impacts how I talk to people about debt. It impacts how I'm going to talk to my daughters about student loans and taking on debt. It still has an impact on me. But the conditions of the loan have been fulfilled. When Jesus says he has fulfilled the law, the conditions of what have been before have been fulfilled. What did the law do? What was the purpose of the law? I only said it 70 times. I'm going to say it 71 now. To mediate the will of God. Now Jesus says, now that he has fulfilled the law, Jesus mediates the will of God. In other words, we don't say law leads us to Jesus. Now we say we look at the law through the lens of Jesus Christ. Our understanding of the old covenant is colored by our understanding of the new covenant, by who Jesus is, by what Jesus teaches, by how Jesus lived his life, by what Jesus taught us about God's mercy and compassion and love for humanity. That's now how we look at this. And there's one more thing Jesus says about this before I want us to look at a couple of examples about this. It's in verse 20. Jesus says this, for I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. Now, you might, if you've been around, if you've kind of wandered around church and worship services for long enough, you may have an opinion of scribes and Pharisees, right? How many of you think scribes and Pharisees are the bad guys in the story of Jesus? Y'all are all afraid to vote. I know it. It's okay. The way that's presented to us is scribes and Pharisees. They're the bad guys, right? But in Jesus' day, they were the good guys. If you had a daughter, you would want your daughter to marry a scribe or Pharisee because they knew the law. They understood at a very deep level the will of God as it had been expressed in the laws and the commandments. They spent their entire lives studying the law, studying the commandments, making sure they understood everything about them. And then they told others, this is how you follow the law. This is how you live in the will of God. But here's what Jesus says about them. Jesus says that along the way, somewhere, they began to love the letter of the law more than they loved the will of God. And Jesus goes after them. In fact, at one point in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus calls them whitewashed tombs. Think about that for just a moment. Whitewashed tombs. What he means by that is that they've spent their entire lives washing the outside of a tomb, basically. But inside there is death and decay. That's how Jesus talks about scribes and Pharisees, because for them, the letter of the law moved in front of everything else. So what does that mean for us? How does that impact how we look at the law through the lens of Jesus? Right? Let's talk about some specific stuff, which, lucky for you, Jesus knew that at this point, after saying all that, we would all be confused. Because what Jesus does next, Jesus gives us 6 examples, one after the other, of what this means to live this way with the Word of God, with Torah, with the law and commandments. And what Jesus does is he has these 6 examples, and they all start the same way. Jesus says this, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." Now, before we look at the examples, I need you to think about how much trouble this got Jesus in. Jesus is basically saying, you've heard it said. In other words, you've heard it said by authorities of Scripture your entire life. You've heard the tradition spoken to you like this your entire life. And then Jesus says this, "But I say to you." In other words, Jesus is about to redefine the commandments for people. We miss how radical this was. This got Jesus in trouble because who was he? Who was he to do this? Well, Jesus already said, "I'm the one who fulfills the law." So here's the first one. You're gonna recognize this. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, "You shall not murder." Anybody disagree with that one? Good. "You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you will be liable to the hell of fire." Jesus says it's not enough to get to the end of your day and say, "Didn't kill anybody today," right? I told some of the staff this week that 97% chance on any given day that I would not murder any of them. 97% chance. That drops to about 85% for Cody. But it's not enough. What Jesus said, Jesus pushes us through this. And he says, what matters is that you begin to conceive and to dream of a time in your life in the world where anger does not have any power over us. Where we begin to see the world as an opportunity not to hold on to grudges, not to insult people, not to push people's buttons, but to live in a world beyond that. Where it's not just enough to say, I'm not going to kill anybody. But I'm going to value all of the relationships around me enough to do what I need to do to step beyond anger and insult. And then Jesus says this about it. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, in other words, once you've stood in line, probably for a couple of days at the temple, and you get to the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Imagine if you have stood in line at Walmart for 2 hours, and then you realize, I need to go deal with this issue. You wouldn't leave your place in Walmart, would you? Of course not. But what Jesus is saying, look, the thing that's priority for us, not ritual, not the letter of the law, not religious expression. What's priority for us are relationships. How we, as people of Jesus Christ, begin to treat others beyond just the bare minimum. And what we find in all of the 6 examples, all 6 of them, is the priority of relationships, the ability to love, to see others as children of God. In fact, let's look at the next one. This is going to be the last one we're going to look at today, but we're going to spend a couple of more weeks talking about this. The next one deals with adultery. Jesus says this, verse 27, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.'" That's in the 10 Commandments. This is a big one. "But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Again, Jesus is pushing past just the letter of the law. to speak to us that how in our hearts and minds, if our ability to see someone is twisted and turned in any way, shape, or form, even by lust, then you know what? We need to fix that. We need to deal with that. Why? Because the will of God shown to us in Jesus Christ is that we love everyone with the love of Christ. We don't love people for what they can give to us, what they can offer to us. We love people simply because they are. What Jesus is really pushing at in all of these is for us to begin to see the world not just as it is, not just through the lens of rules and laws, but to see the world through the lens of the love of Jesus Christ. That in every encounter, in every moment, we seek to live the will of God expressed in the life of Jesus Christ. And what Jesus wants us to do is Jesus wants to open our eyes. Jesus wants us to expand our imaginations, our holy and moral imaginations, to function in the world differently than anyone in history ever has before. What Jesus offers us here in Matthew chapter 5 isn't just another set of checklists to say, okay, now I'm not going to do that, I'm not going to do that, but opens our minds to say, you know what? Here's what Jesus would have me dream in this moment of life if I'm going to live in the will of God. Let me tell you a story about someone I think has done this in an amazing, amazing way. In 1990, in Burundi, there was a civil war. It was a religious civil war. Religious people, even Christians, committing genocide against other people. Hundreds of thousands of people died. One lady named Maggie Berenkitsi watched 72 people that she knew and loved, including her best friend Juliet. She watched them be viciously murdered in front of her. When the war was over, the country was devastated. There were thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of children who had no parents. Their parents had been killed. They just wandered, lived as best they could. There were people all over the country who wanted revenge and retaliation, who were waiting for the day to get back at those who had killed their loved ones. Maggie Berenkitsi, though, decided that she wanted to forge a different path for the people that she knew, that she loved, for even the people who had killed her friends. And here's what she did. She established a home, Maison Shalom, the house of peace. And she established this orphanage on one of the killing fields of Burundi where thousands of people had been killed. And she provided place for orphans to come and to be loved, to be educated, to learn skills, to find a life beyond the anger and the destruction that they had seen as children. And over the course of decades, she has ministered to over 30,000 orphans. When someone asked her why she did that, this is what she said. She said, because love makes us inventors. Because love makes us inventors. I think that's the heart of what Jesus is getting at for us here. That in the love of Jesus Christ, we become inventors. Inventors of a way that we might live out the will of God in the world in a new way, mediated by our relationship with Jesus Christ and no other. So here's my challenge to you this week. Next week, we're going to talk about the law of retaliation. We're going to talk about an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But here's what I want you to do before we get to that. Approach your week. Approach your marriage, your work relationships. Approach your relationship with your extended family even with just that kind of imagination empowered by the love of Christ. And let that begin to guide you into the will of God. Not that you don't, not that you ignore the law and what has been, but that you see through it and beyond it to what God might do through you in the world today. Our call is not simply to follow what others have done. That's not our call. Our call as people of Jesus is to imagine a world where the words, the life, and the teachings of Jesus take precedent, not for others, but for us. Let's pray. God, it would probably be easier for us if Jesus had just said, follow the commandments. Instead, what Jesus has done for us has opened us to the fullness of who you are, the fullness of your desire for the world. And Jesus has invited us with holy imagination to live in your will. So God, open our eyes and our hearts and our minds and our imaginations to do more than the letter of the law, to find a way to live the will of God. Not 2 months from now or 2 days from now, but in the next few minutes and moments. In the name of Christ we pray.